Good afternoon and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's briefing on Nigeria, elections and human rights. We have a great panel assembled for you here today that I'll introduce in just a moment. As you know, in February 2019, Nigeria will hold its first national election since the nation's peaceful transfer of political power in 2015. While pre-election assessments suggest positive developments by electoral stakeholders, many Nigerians expect a close presidential race and possible efforts to manipulate the process. Some fear that a combination of factors could fuel electoral violence, particularly as the country continues to face significant human rights challenges. So, on this very complex and important topic, I'm excited to introduce to you the panel we have today. Starting from this side, we have John Tomaszewski, or JT, the Regional Director for Africa at the International Republican Institute. Next to him, we have Oge Onubogu, the Senior Program Officer for Africa Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And at the end of the panel, we have Kristina Arriaga, Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for coming to share your expertise with us. JT, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jamie. And in respect to the co-chairs, members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, my fellow panelists, and the distinguished audience, my name is John Tomaszewski. I'm the Africa Regional Director for the International Republican Institute. First, I'd like to commend the Commission for holding this briefing at this time. It couldn't have come any sooner, and it is much needed, and we need to keep this conversation going. So I hope that we'll continue to have this conversation in the new year. It's crucial that right now we shine a spotlight on Nigeria because we are entering into a period of sort of no turning back in terms of electoral preparation, in terms of the path forward on a number of amendments and the funding process, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But certainly in terms of also getting U.S. policymakers to focus on what is really an important election, I would say the most important on the continent in 2019. I think someone would debate me on that, but I know not Nigerians would not. IRI, just to give you a little bit about IRI, we've worked in Nigeria since 1998. So we've been there throughout the Fourth Republic and have observed every general election since '99. The primary work that we do is with political parties, building their capacity, strengthening their internal democracy, engaging cross-party dialogue. What you'll find specific to our work throughout the country is that we put a specific emphasis on women, youth, and persons with disabilities, and when possible, IDPs and ethnic minorities. So we do try to make sure that we are engaging in the issue of inclusivity in Nigerian politics, which is a major problem. It's difficult for anyone to generalize Nigeria, so some people will say, women don't participate in politics, or youth don't get a chance. That's largely true, but there are examples where there is progress. So it's important as we talk about Nigeria, we don't think about it as one big basket, but as a bunch of smaller baskets with a lot of different little things going on that do interconnect, but certainly have their own characteristics. We currently have offices and staff in 5 locations in Nigeria, in Abuja, Bauchi, Adamawa, Ebonyi, and Sokoto. We're currently looking at the first election since one of the most historic ones, which was in 2015, where Goodluck Jonathan engaged in a hard-fought campaign as an incumbent of the People's Democratic Party against Muhammadu Buhari in the All-Progressive Congress. Buhari came out on top, and we saw for the first time an actual transition of power from a majority party to an opposition. That resulted in, I think, a lot of adulation and celebration and optimism on the part of Nigerians, the international community. Certainly working on Africa issues, and I cover about 17 countries. That was a very important example that the Nigerians set, that a lot of people have used to help guide their own movement towards greater democracy in their countries. So these elections are important, and they're important because a lot of people look at them and copy them, and want to do what the Nigerians are doing, or maybe not do it, depending on how it goes. Certainly, these elections play off of that optimism, which hasn't necessarily been met in terms of policy and in terms of leadership. And there are a number of challenges that only got worse since 2015. We continue to see things with regards to the security landscape. At some point, President Buhari had declared victory over Boko Haram. That victory was a false one, and certainly we continue to see challenges with Boko Haram. We'll talk probably in greater detail about a number of other security challenges. We also continue to see the marginalization of women and political life of the country. In fact, we will probably come out of this election worse off than we were in the last election in terms of the number of candidates and those who will successfully make it through. And a lot of that has to do with the way that the political system is structured. Very Godfather, patriarchal driven, focused on money and resources, many of which are out of the reach of the vast majority of Nigerians, and certainly have a role to play in putting people on the sidelines and not participating in the process fairly and freely. Corruption also, while the president has come out very hard in his early days against corruption right after being elected, and has played a role in drying up some of the classic lines of influence and money. Corruption is still a very big problem, and it's probably even worse lower down the lines than it was before. We are now seeing that take its shape, not in the form of in-kind inducements, but actual cash. In a number of elections that we have looked at in the off-cycle gubernatorial elections, whether it's Ekiti or Osun, we saw exchanges of money outside of polling units. We are seeing people being bought off just for both sides. There was a point at which there was a rerun in 7 polling units in Osun State after those polling units had a technical glitch and were called inconclusive, according to the way that the law is written. People who went to those polls walked down the street and received money from one candidate, then another candidate, and they were the richest people in Nigeria that day. They received so much money. But the issue of money in politics and the issue of vote buying can't be changed with a good civic and voter education campaign or simply by telling people that's a bad idea. In fact, in some cases, we watch people take money in front of signs that say, "Don't sell your vote." It's got to be done from a multi-stakeholder effort. It's something that we're looking at and working with political parties on. But it also has to be dealt with in terms of actually enforcing the law, investigating people, arresting them. And in cases where we saw the perp walk action, where people were found buying votes, it did serve to somewhat of a deterrent. IRI will, along with its partner, the National Democratic Institute, IRI and NDI are both nonpartisan organizations, so although we're here in the halls of Congress and we hear the word Republican and Democrat, we're actually nonpartisan. If you don't believe it, we can talk about it later. But we are part of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy. We will both jointly observe elections in 2019, and the mission that we'll field in February will be about 40 observers, short-term observers, and I think 18 or so in February. 18, yeah, something like that, maybe a little bit more. 20, okay, 20. This is not a lot, but it's what we have funding for, and we'd like to do more. And one thing that we'd like to talk to our congressional colleagues about, staff, but also policymakers back at state and USAID, is that Nigeria is a big country, and we've learned the challenges of international observation from the past. If you don't do enough, it's almost as bad as doing nothing at all. And that's why it's important that as we look at partnering with domestic observer groups, working with civil society actors who are watching the election, whether it's through the lens of preventing violence, voter and civic education, or even looking at issues like vote buying and political finance. We've got to work with the resources we have, the observers that we've budgeted for, and take them with our partnerships and try to cover as much of the country as we can. Because fraud doesn't happen in capitals, doesn't happen in Abuja. It happens where no one sees it. So as many eyes as we can get to where we can get them, that'll be a focus in the next couple of months. I'll head to Nigeria next week to participate in the third of set of pre-election observations that we've done. We did one around the Oshun gubernatorial by-election, and of course the Kiti as well. This one for December will be led by Linda Thomas-Greenfield and a number of other key technical experts. And what we'll be looking at is we're going to be in Abuja talking to stakeholders and saying, listen, we've made a lot of recommendations. They've actually implemented some. And when I say they, it's not just INEC, it's the government, it's civil society, it's other groups. But really honing in on these issues of vote buying, security, and then matters related to campaigns and the disinformation that we're seeing. We've watched in awe as the president of Nigeria had to come out and clarify that he is not a clone and that he's alive this week. And we do chuckle with that because it's true, it's kind of crazy to think about that someone would have to do that. But people believed it. And if they didn't believe it, they pushed the message. Issues of disinformation and fake news are not a problem just for America and certainly for Western countries. But it's not a new thing either. This is part of politics in Nigeria. Misinformation, big men taking to Twitter chats and all kinds of other things to pass out data that's not accurate. There are some efforts, and this should be commended by Nigerian media groups that have come out and come together to start doing a fact-checking process. That's not enough. There needs to be responsible communication on things. Without that, you're going to cause violence. Without that, you're going to create serious problems and questions about the credibility of the elections. If you don't have a credible institution, and we've seen a number of political parties, opposition parties on the African continent, go after the credibility of institutions as a means of trying to bring victory and doubt of their opponent, you're going to have a serious problem. And that seems to be what the opposition is doing right now, really taking aim at the institution. Whether that's good or bad, and there are some questions to be said about what INEC, the Electoral Commission, is doing to prepare for these elections, but it's got to be done on a factual basis, looking at things technically. Doing so without facts creates serious problems and leaves people wondering what kind of election will they have. I'll just finally sum it up by saying that, we look at these elections as the Nigeria, something that is there for the Nigerian people. We engage with them as partners and really look forward to having this dialogue because I do think that, again, the U.S. has an important role to play in the success of this vote.
Thank you. Open.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the co-chairs of the Lantos Human Rights Commission, as well as the members of the Commission for convening this briefing on Nigeria today. I think, along with my colleagues here, we all agree that this is a very timely discussion and much needed discussion on Nigeria. So I appreciate this opportunity to present my views. I'm a senior program officer at the United States Institute of Peace. And although the views I express here today are my own, I would just like to let you know that the USIP was established by the US Congress over 30 years ago as an independent national institute to prevent and resolve violent conflicts abroad in accordance with US and national interest. It's a privilege to be here today along with my colleagues to discuss the risk, human rights challenges, and opportunities around the upcoming elections in one of Africa's most important countries. So Nigeria's keenly anticipated elections, the presidential and national elections, are expected to happen on February 16, 2019, while the elections for the state governors and state assemblies are scheduled 2 weeks later, March 2nd, 2019. As JT has already laid out a background of why these elections are important, these elections will be happening 20 years after the restoration of multi-party constitutional rule in Nigeria. They are also following the country's first ever peaceful transition of power, which happened in 2015. Most importantly, these 2019 elections will test the resilience of Nigeria's democratic institutions to successfully conduct 2 consecutive credible elections. While we're all aware and we all know that democratization is not a linear process. Many Nigerians expect further progress from what they saw in 2015, including a credible electoral process. Nigeria has made major strides in its democratic development. However, the country still struggles to control the widespread violence that plagues a lot of its communities. Nigeria's democracy remains fragile and its elections remain vulnerable. Political parties in Nigeria are now in full campaign mode ahead of next year's elections, and unfortunately, we're already seeing signs of election. We're already seeing emerging signs of election violence. However, it's not too late for Nigerians and the international community to take concrete steps to reduce the risk of election-related violence in 2019. The United States, for one, has actively encouraged Nigeria's democratic progress in the past and should once again step up its focus and attention on Nigeria's 2019 elections. To do this effectively, it's crucial that as much attention be paid to flashpoints at the state level as we pay to the high-profile campaigns for president. International and domestic observers have already reported incidents of voter intimidation by security forces and party agents during the rerun of the off-cycle elections in Osun State in September. This already illustrates the intensity of state elections. Now, elections in 2019 that are scheduled for other states that are considered more high-profile than Osun State are even likely to be more volatile. The 2019 state elections will usher in leadership in some of the most populous and economically important states in Nigeria and indeed most of Africa. These states include Lagos, Kano, and Rivers, as well as states that are also currently experiencing recurring intercommunal violence, including Plateau, Kaduna, and Benue. The gubernatorial elections will take place in 29 of Nigeria's 36 states, just 2 weeks after the national elections. 7 other state elections are all off-cycle for various reasons. State elections in Nigeria are very important for the country's democratic progress. Moreover, the country's powerful state governors that emerge after these state elections have the power to allocate federally dispersed revenue. They also play an important role in shaping policy and development, in shaping policies around development and security. Most importantly, they also oversee the state election commissions. The state election commissions manage local elections across Nigeria's 774 local government areas. In a USIP study conducted this year, in a lot of our interviews, a lot of respondents spoke about the growing prominence of local government elections, because these local government elections are serving as a testing ground for body politicians. In other words, democracy, looking at democracy at the grassroots. The USIP study was conducted in 8 states plus a federal capital territory, Abuja. And in that study, we found that many political and conflict conditions have changed since 2015. So it's important for all of us to understand the nature of these changes and the forces behind them, that we also consider all of this when we weigh whether election-related violence at the national or the state level is likely to happen, and if so, how do we prevent it or mitigate the consequences? Among some of these changes are the shifting perceptions of narratives of security and insecurity. The prominence of the pastoralist farmer conflicts has shaped perceptions that large parts of Nigeria are insecure. Clashes between farmers and herders over land and water have escalated and are particularly deadly in the northern states of Benue, Taraba, Plateau, Adamawa, Zamfara, and Kaduna. Some of these states, including Benue and Plateau, fall within the politically influential region of north-central Nigeria. In the country's northeast, the military claims that it has technically defeated Boko Haram, While it claims that it has done this, the terrorist group continues to stage very well-publicized attacks. Meanwhile, paramilitary forces such as the Civilian Joint Task Force that were organized in response to the threat have also posed a danger in places such as Borno State in northeast Nigeria, and Borno State being the epicenter of the Boko Haram insurgency. So the state-level elections in Borno State for the term-limited Governor Kashim Shettima is actually one that is very important for us to watch. Another significant change since 2015 is a lot of the deepening divisions that we see within the two largest political parties, the APC and the PDP. Particularly within the APC continues to exhibit an inability to consolidate its internal party structure and effectively resolve internal conflicts. The recent party primaries conducted in October in the APC-led Zamfara state was marred with violence, and the party leadership of the APC has still been unable to address the grievances within the party. Preparations for the state elections in Zamfara still remain controversial. Apart from the conflicts within, or the divisions, the deepening divisions within the political parties, we also continue to see the rivalry between the APC and the PDP. This continues to remain intense. This competition is especially prominent in the Niger Delta region, and very prominent in the region's leading oil-producing state, Rivers State. Rivers State is really considered a political prize for any political party that is able to capture control of the state. According to the Fund for Peace, Rivers State experienced the most election violence incidents and fatalities of any Nigerian state during the 2015 elections. Political hostilities in Rivers State have heightened, and we also continue to see a personal rivalry, political rivalries there, especially between the former governor and now current transportation minister of the state, who is from the APC, and then the current state governor, Nyesom Wike, who is from the PDP. This continues to exacerbate divisions along party lines. Despite the short amount of time before the elections, there are still opportunities for action. First, clear plans for the prevention of election violence need to be in place now. These plans should be effectively communicated to citizens by the INEC and security agencies and should be sustained longer to contain post-election incidents. For many Nigerians, the memories of election-related violence are still current because the Nigerian government has been unable to establish mechanisms to address electoral offenses. The National Human Rights Commission in Nigeria, which is a statutory body mandated to document human rights violations and initiate processes for prosecution, is a weak institution and has been relatively ineffective since 2015. A bill to create a specialized electoral offenses commission is still pending in the National Assembly, and it is unlikely that this bill will pass before the 2019 elections. With less than three months to the elections, the US and international community should prioritize engagements with their Nigerian counterparts on ways to effectively address and prosecute electoral offenses in the 2019 elections. In addition, Nigeria should hold itself to a higher standard when it comes to prosecuting electoral offenses. Prioritizing the passage and implementation of the bill to establish a specialized electoral offenses commission could be a good place to start. In the short term, Nigerian authorities should identify credible state-level and community leaders in advance of the elections who could provide leadership and advice or even mediation in the event of rising tensions. USIP's Nigeria Working Group on Peace Building and Governance, which is a group of eminent civic leaders from Nigeria from diverse backgrounds, could be a good source of support to the Nigerian authorities. Other community leaders with skills and influence to prevent and diffuse violence should be engaged as well. The National Peace Committee in Nigeria, which played an important role in securing peaceful transition of presidential power in 2015, should be re-energized. Given the current realities and possibilities of higher levels of violence during the gubernatorial elections, peace committees should also be created at the state level. Some states already have institutions designed to reduce violence, such as the Plateau State Peacebuilding Agency, the Kaduna State Peacebuilding Commission, and the Adamawa State Peace Commission. These bodies are still relatively young. The USIP is working closely with them and with local community leaders to address state-level violence before, during, and after the 2019 elections. Secondly, the US and other international supporters of the electoral process in Nigeria should intensify their efforts to reinforce the work of key institutions that administer and support the electoral process, most notably the INEC and the Nigerian police. INEC's election management process has improved over the years, but challenges remain. Since 2015, the Commission has carried out commendable reforms. However, their good technical work may be of limited value if it is not widely known, understood, or trusted by the electorate, or if voters feel that they will experience intimidation on election day. Nigeria's security agencies as well, particularly the police, which is the lead agency on election security, should commit to better coordination with INEC and neutrality in the electoral process in order to positively influence voter confidence. The US government should support INEC and the Nigerian police to ensure that the existing Interagency Consultative Committee on Election Security serves as an effective coordinating mechanism. INEC as well should also implement more assertive public relations strategy, one that goes beyond just generic voter information and civic education, but that is designed to really reflect the current realities of the different regions, the different states, and the elections in Nigeria. Finally, Nigeria will be looked to in the region to fulfill its proper role as one of the best examples of democratic development in Africa. While there has been much improvement, Nigeria's political leaders can and should do better. The United States and the international community, including the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, should intensify their pre-election diplomacy. All stakeholders with potential influence on Nigeria's leaders can convey their expectations that Nigeria's political parties act responsibly throughout campaigns, balloting, and the post-election period. They are also in a very good position to convey to Nigerian leaders an expectation that political parties discipline their members, officials, and their candidates if they violate standards of acceptable conduct. The 2015 elections raised citizen expectations for government performance in Nigeria. A credible electoral process in 2019 will strengthen Nigeria's democratic development and enhance public confidence in its democratic institutions. A flawed election could result in a regression in democratic values in Nigeria and weaken the democratic progress that we see in much of West Africa. Despite its many challenges, Nigeria shows a commitment to democratic values. It is in the interest of the US and the international community to continue supporting Nigeria's democratic development and focusing our efforts to reduce election-related violence in 2019, especially in the state gubernatorial elections, could be a good place to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you. I join my fellow panelists in thanking the committee for holding this extraordinarily timely hearing, and I'm honored to be with such great superstar experts on the region. Thank you for having me. When I first came to Washington, D.C. over 30 years ago, someone told me that Washington, D.C. was Hollywood for the ugly. which I thought was funny. We come here not to make a lot of money, right? We come here to make a difference, to change people's lives, to improve the human rights situation worldwide. If you have only the next 90 days to work on human rights issues, I promise investing in doing it in Nigeria will have long-term consequences for the entire world, not only for the continent. The United States Commission International Religious Freedom is a bipartisan U.S. government advisory body. Our mandate is to monitor religious freedom around the world according to international standards. The commission is led by 9 private sector unpaid volunteer commissioners and is supported by 20 professional staff. My colleague Ferdoz Baga, who is the specialist in Africa and traveled with me, is here. I'm one of the unpaid 9 people and the vice chairwoman. At USEF for the last 20 years, we have seen a strong correlation between religious freedom and a country's stability and a country's chance to emerging as a democratic champion for all of its people. Last month, we conducted a trip to Nigeria. We were in Lagos. We went down to Abuja and drove 6 hours up north to Plateau. Nigeria will overtake the United States as the most populous country by the year 2050. And yet, half of its people right now, over 87 million people, live in extreme poverty. 228,000 Nigerians are refugees. Boko Haram and its dangerous offshoot, ISIS West Africa, have displaced 2.5 million people in Nigeria alone. This is all compounded by the struggle over resources, which was mentioned by both panelists, in the Middle Belt, which happens to be the source of food for most of Nigeria. There are at least 475 languages spoken in Nigeria. This is at a meeting in Plateau between herders or pastoralists and farmers. They each spoke a different language, so we had to bring a third language interpreter to talk to each other. But what's remarkable about this picture is that they're standing there in peace, looking to the U.S. to resolve their issues. What's even more outstanding is the story of one man who I think illustrates the conflict in Nigeria. He said his brother had been killed. He was a herder. And I asked him, did you go to the police? And he goes, why would I go? They wouldn't pay attention. They have bigger problems to resolve. The police does not keep data on people who are murdered. But what's even more remarkable is that he said, I forgive those who did it, who were most likely in that same room. I forgive those who did it. I just want to go back to being able to feed my family. While in Nigeria, we also met with a lot of inspiring people who are investing in Nigeria. A lot of Nigerian Americans that are going back to Nigeria to try to assist in the democratic process. Nigeria's success is a success for the continent, meaning it is a success for the entire world. And the United States Congress has a unique opportunity right now in the next 90 days to partner with our stellar staff in Abuja under Ambassador Symington to assist in many ways. Even the presence of a U.S. congressman in Nigeria makes a difference. Where else in the world can we say that? While in Nigeria, we met with dozens of religious leaders, civil society organizations, community colors and youth, government, security officials, general, human rights activists, and a lot of civil actors. They're all hopeful for the 2019 elections. While they all know what has been talked about before, they're hopeful. And because these communities are also strongly united by religious and ethnic identities, even though that poses a problem sometimes, it also poses a great opportunity, and that is that religious leaders have a very important voice and part to play in these elections. Unfortunately, some church communities are not able to get along like the herders and the pastoralists in the previous community. This is also in Plateau. This is a church that was burned to the ground in a tiny teen community where people live in poverty before, like you've never seen before. And I have traveled the world over in the last 30 years. The altar was burned, and still Christians got together just 2 weeks ago to try to worship. And their services were interrupted by someone who had called apparently some youth gangs to try and disrupt it. We went to speak to the Muslims in the same community who had the same feelings about their Christian neighbors. And yet, as we left the town, they all gathered at the same well to take water. This is very small areas with very high level of conflict. They cannot call the police. The police sometimes takes 2 to 4 hours to show up, or they never do. They cannot rely on information because no one gathers the name of the dead or the people who have been killed. So sometimes it's journalists who are recording the local violence in these communities. Life is not cheap, and it should not be cheap in Nigeria simply because the authorities are looking in the other way. Of course, you all know about the dangers that Boko Haram presents to the area. As you know, Boko Haram has now morphed into a new organization, ISIS West Africa. That organization is considered to be much more dangerous than Boko Haram because they're getting a lot of support from people whom they are supporting with basic social services in their communities. If we let this get out of control, it's going to take down the entire infrastructure that has been so painfully built in Nigeria. Unfortunately, we see a lot of issues with rule of law. For instance, there has been no justice against the 300 IMN members that were killed in 2015 in Zaria. As you know, most of Muslims in Nigeria are Sunni, but there are also 3 Shia sects. Just a few weeks ago, October 28th and November the 1st, Shia Muslims marched across multiple cities in an annual religious peaceful protection. Human rights organizations with whom we met personally documented in hospitals at least 45 people killed and 122 injured who were in hiding, fearing to get medical treatment for fear of being incarcerated. The violence and the hostility between groups has increased dramatically over the last year. Most of the conflicts manifest in Muslims versus Christians. However, we also know that there are other religious groups or non-religious people like atheists and animists and Baha'i who are also victims to the conflict. The Nigerian government has remained silent and has allowed these issues to happen with impunity. That becomes a big problem. When the police who are supposed to take care of you don't have the resources, don't have the backing of the government, and many of them have to buy their own bullets in order to be able to defend themselves. Judges in Nigeria are not only judges, they also take notes during trials. There's no scrivener during the trials. Many people are tried in groups. Many names are confused. Imagine living in a society where you cannot call the police. There's no 911 number you can call when your neighbor is getting murdered by another neighbor. Nigeria, as I mentioned earlier, data collection is extremely limited, with a lot of people having to rely on journalists rather than other government entities. Christians report in the north that there's great prejudice. In the south, Muslims have reported that they're unable to go to school or they're unable to get jobs. This month, for instance, USERV is also beginning a research study to study the implementation of Islamic law in the north and to see what is happening to its application and its impact on religious freedom. Nigerians are worried that there will be violence ahead of the 2019 elections and that with further crimes targeting ethnic groups. Just as in the past few years, religious leaders and other elites are using their platforms to encourage Nigerians to vote, the next 90 days are crucial. If these religious leaders are able to call for a peaceful, democratic transition, there's a good chance that this could happen in Nigeria. Each year, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom issues a report with very specific recommendations. I won't go through all of them. I just want to give you 4 that you can take back, and these are fairly easy to implement. First, high-level presence in Nigeria is watch and observe. If your member of Congress, your member of committee can go to Nigeria during this time, Nigerians will know that the U.S. is watching and the U.S. cares. Professionalizing and training the police is key. That's going to take a long time, but again, even being present before, during, and after the elections will make a mark. The herders are largely illiterate. They get all of their news and information from radio. That's a very easy place for the United States Congress to be funding more NGOs to put out their message, and for us ourselves to be sending a message of peace, reconciliation, and fair elections in Nigeria. Social media plays a key part. We drove through many cities without electricity or water. However, there were towers and people had cell phones and people had access to Facebook. Just this week, BBC reported that some of the worst news for the plateau were coming out of a suburb in England, someone who had been spreading fake news. We need to stop that, and we have many partners that can help us out. Finally, diaspora engagement. There are over 600,000 Nigerians in this country who want to help. Over half of them have bachelor's degrees, are highly educated. Your members can engage with diaspora communities in their states. As I mentioned earlier, in our line of work, it's easy to get overwhelmed and think we cannot make a difference. But the people in Nigeria that I met who were your age, who were looking at us for assistance, are heavily invested in Nigeria. So I invite you for the next 90 days to have the most creative ideas that you can have. I always wonder why the bad guys are so much better at social media than we are. We need to be more clever. We need to be focused in the next 90 days on the election, and then afterwards to affect civil society. Thank you.
Thank you all for your statements. We're going to transition now to a time of questions. I'll ask the first question, and then we'll open it up for discussion in the audience. You all can ask. Each of you have talked about how communities are worried that political or communal violence could dramatically increase during and in the aftermath of the elections. Could you talk about how the communities that you most directly work with feel about this prospect? And what measures or group protection strategies are they taking to guard against this violence? Are people feeling increasingly more or less confident as the elections are approaching? And just kind of what is the feeling on the ground for those groups who are most vulnerable? Anyone can start with this?
I'm sorry, whose name do you say?
The question is to all three panelists.
Yes, but, okay.
You want me to go? I can go.
So it's important to sort of put this into the context of it's a huge country, it's really big, and there's a lot of people. Let's just put it out there. Also, it has a very long history with a lot of different dynamics that plague the North and the South. Added to that, the political realm of at least the geographic elements of the political parties, who's governor where, what money's where, who's elected where. That plays into all of this. The other issues, of course, are elements within the presidency, the vice presidency, and national security structure, and where they're putting their priorities and money right now. They're looking at sort of different pictures than maybe we're putting forward here, but I think some of that's political, some of that's not, right? Relocating top military officials to the north to deal with the Boko Haram issue is as much a security issue, but it's also linked to showing, right, that you're doing something about it, right? I would say in terms of how communities are dealing with this, I mentioned to you that we work in about 4 states right now, specifically not dealing with like the big political parties, but actually the smaller political units, these sort of local officials who aren't elected, but just kind of get together, support the party, support the process, engage with civil society, talk with security officials, and some of them are elected officials, some of them are local government. What we're seeing is a mixed picture. So is there a growing anxiety about how the polls will play out on election day? I would say that anxiety is much higher, as Oge sort of put forward in her testimony, in what we'll see in the March elections. I think there's a lot of anxiety about how the governorship elections, state assembly elections will play out. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that because elections have become more competitive, right? This is not singularly about ideology or anything like that, but elections have become extremely competitive, and it's sort of a everything or nothing type of scenario at the state level. It used to be that way primarily at that national level, but the cake has moved. And we're seeing governors put everything they have into winning, and the parties that they're running against also equaling that. And the amount of money that gets poured into that is something to really watch, because that fuels also conflict. What IRI is looking at the community level right now with some state level polling is the role of youth gangs in the process. So if you want to kill somebody during an election, the old man doesn't do it. He pays a couple kids who are busy washing cars or driving around their motorbikes and says, make a little extra, go down there and start some trouble. And if you hurt somebody, that's okay. And we're trying to look at that because we do see that as an issue, and it's something that continues to be a problem in a number of communities, and certainly was a problem in past elections in Nigeria where youth were used sort of as the goons to go in and start serious problems, especially as elections got tight. We saw tense periods during the ballot counting process in both Ekiti and Osun states. These ballots are not counted in a closed room. This isn't Zimbabwe where they lock you in for 5 hours and then you come out on the other end and, I don't know, you get a result that's posted on the door. That might be what was counted. What actually happens is, and what we saw, was that these ballots are counted in front of everybody. Now, the good thing is it's transparent. The bad thing is it's in front of everybody. Think about the poll workers who are watching this process. They're National Youth Service people. These are like college kids, young people who may have not gone to college yet. And they're actually managing these polls. And we watched in one case, poll workers really being harassed and sort of screamed at and things like that, you know, by the crowds that form around. I think those ballot counting processes will be very tense. I think whatever happens during the lead up to election day, certainly the campaigns will be rough. Voting day will be tough. I mean, we saw a number of examples in reports coming out of Osun, and certainly in the sense of Ekiti, where security forces engaged at a much greater degree than what we have been led to believe in terms of what they said their role was. However, counter to that is that in a number of polling units on election day in Osun, we did see female security officers and a number of security officers without weapons, sitting on the sidelines, sometimes asleep, just hanging out, waiting for the day to end. And that's the reality here. You've got to look at the pockets, because it's not going to be one story for the entire country. I think even some of the issues that have been raised here do not reflect the entire country. These are in particular areas. We've got to look at those hotspot areas and see how we can treat it. And I think that's how communities look at it as well. We've spoken with religious leaders, the head of the mosque in Abuja, the National Mosque, the head of the Kuka Center, and some of these other places. They tell us there's no religious conflict in this country, and we say, I'm in Washington, D.C., and certainly looking at the research that's out there, there's a religious conflict. There's an issue, right? So having those debates on the ground, those dialogues, that's what's crucial, is to get the communities who have these issues to talk to each other and to really bring in those national assets and those state level assets. And I think Boogie makes the point that some of these peace committees at the state level can be really helpful if they get out to the ground, go into these communities and engage, and where there are language barriers, helping to really deal with them.
I could just add to that. I think just in addition to that, we've really seen an increase in political consciousness in Nigeria. I think for a lot of Nigerians, the 2015 elections basically showed what is possible. It showed that the change can happen through the ballot box. And with these elections, as we go into 2019, these are the elections where young people who were born after the transition, this is actually the first elections that they will be participating in. So they're basically your Nigerian born frees. And these individuals have never experienced the disappointment of a dictatorship or lived under the past military dictatorships in Nigeria or under the past one-party system. So they have very high expectations of the government. And I think what we see at the community level is a reflection of this, that at that level, individuals just want to see what type of change can happen in their communities. They want to be connected in the decision-making process. They want to make sure that those who are elected to represent them in Abuja at the National Assembly or in the state assemblies are able to effectively represent their views. So these are the conversations that we see happening at the local level. And in USIP's work, a lot of what we do with the Nigerian Working Group on Peace Building and Governance, which is a group that I mentioned that we convened in 2016, it's made up of senior civic leaders from senior Nigerian civic leaders who are drawn from diverse backgrounds, from the military to religious actors, from academia to academia. These individuals are trying to serve as that point to connect community voices to the voices of decision makers. There's also engaging with local actors through our network of facilitators. And through the network of Nigerian facilitators, this is where we've been able to identify leaders in their different communities who are able to implement intergroup dialogues to be able to resolve small conflicts. What we've seen in Nigeria is that a lot of the big conflicts that we see usually start off small. And without effective mechanisms to address them at the community level, it blows up and spirals into a Boko Haram insurgency that now you're unable to handle. So we've seen the effectiveness of really working at that local level, getting the voices involved in the conversation, because at the end of the day, they are able to effectively identify the solutions to the problems in their communities, and working closely with actors who can then ensure that what they identify are moved to policymakers and that those recommendations can actually move into real action. I think that for us is the process that we've taken in Nigeria to move beyond just the conversation, just the dialogue, but actually taking the recommendations from that and ensuring that they move into real actions, and then back community members can actually see that their voices have been taken into account.